Well, now we begin the third panel. Today we have Professor Andrew Lambert. I think that one of the leading, maybe the leading historian in naval history and grand strategies nowadays. Andrew Lambert is professor in the Lawton Unit, the department focused on naval history in the King's College in London, and well, a prolific author about naval history, defense, deterrence, and grand strategy. So it could be impossible to describe all the fields and specialized areas that Professor Lambert has wrote about it. But well, I think that it will be better to shorten the intro and go directly to the lecture, and pray for it if we have time for the Q&A. Anyway, so Professor Lambert, the ship is yours.
Many thanks, Paul. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be here in this fabulous city and to talk about things that I think, with any luck, will be of mutual interest. How you create identity, how you market identity, and what identity looks like in the context of an emerging state. So this image is very much about maritime power. It is not an accurate representation of the Battle of Trafalgar. It is an encapsulation of what it means to be a maritime great power in the age of the Napoleonic Wars. The artist, James W. Turner, is the artist of English identity in an era when the English are excluded from Europe by continental conflict, 1793 to 1815. Turner is summing all of that up and representing it through an icon. Much like your icon, it's a ship. It tells you a great deal about who you think you are. If your icon is a ship, you look at the sea, you're thinking about the sea. The sea is important culturally, it's important economically, it's important politically. You're making a great statement by hanging a ship out as your representative. Turner also saw Britain as part of a very long continuum of sea power states. I wrote about this a few years ago. Sea power states are asymmetric. They do not conform to the normal concepts of power. Normally, the bigger your state, the more people you have in it, the larger your land area, the more powerful you are. Sea power states are states that recognize they are never going to be big. They are never going to have very large continental territory, certainly not in the European context. And they find their way to great power status by maximizing the sea, not the land. So the sea power states of history, which I'll run through quickly, have all found ways of doing this, and they are intellectually connected. This is not a repeating pattern, this is a following pattern. Most of the ideas were discussed in ancient Athens, they were reduced to order, and they were transmitted. Everybody who's tried to create a sea power state since Periclean Athens has been copying. They've been developing, embellishing, extending, modifying, but the basic arguments go all the way back to ancient Greece. And here we have Pericles in a helmet. Nobody ever addresses Parliament in a helmet, and this is a German picture, which probably explains why he's wearing a helmet. But Pericles is telling the Athenians something very important. You have made a conscious choice to be a sea power. The Athenians had a massive windfall in their silver mines, and they spent it not on an army or on public ceremonies, they spent it on 200 cutting-edge warships. The world's first purpose-built battleships. They're triremes, they have an oar crew of 180, and they have no other purpose than sinking other ships. If you build 200 of these, you're making a big political decision. They then connect ancient Athens, the little bit around the Acropolis, all the way down to the Piraeus as a fortress with access to the sea. They turn Athens into a strategic island so they can't be defeated by a siege. They extend their empire across the Aegean, and they're using as their primary weapon not the ships, but democracy. The sea power state is exporting inclusive government. Inclusive government is critical to sea power states because if you don't have the economic dynamism on board in your political process, it doesn't work. Autocratic states cannot be sea powers because the autocrat is concerned about regime stability. They don't want to give any license to individual economic actors. So an inclusive democracy, not a full modern democracy, but a democracy of those who are entitled by wealth, by status, by opportunity, is the only way forward in the ancient world. So the Athenian democracy is the thing that really frightens their enemies. It's not their ships, it's not their walls, it's their political process. And they weaponize it. During the Peloponnesian War, when they conquer territory, they impose a democracy. We can imagine the exact reverse happening, but that's what they're doing. They're imposing democracy as a way of opening up. And they're using the wealth of the sea to subsidize their war effort. And this will be repeated. So this is the Germans trying to get to grips with Pericles. You'll notice he's pointing at the Parthenon. You're all familiar with this. The greatest building in the ancient world, a magnificent statement of intent, the centerpiece of a democratic revolution. When you walk down from the Parthenon, and many of you will have done this, when you get to the head of the steps to walk away from the Parthenon, you are looking at the battlefield of Salamis, the great naval battle that made Greece free. And that's deliberate. That's a conscious structural choice. You've seen our magnificence, and if you want to know why, it's just at the foot of the hill, just out to sea. So they're making a huge statement of intent. Little wonder the Spartans, who were all about armies and standing still, were really frightened. As Thucydides says, the Spartans were alarmed by all of this, and that's where the war comes from. So this is a different way of looking at the world. It's a challenge. The Spartans are frightened, and so is the superpower of the age, the Persian Empire. And ultimately, Persia and Sparta will ally to bring down the Athenian democracy. And when they do, they burn the ships, they destroy the dockyard, and they remove the democracy, because all of those three things together is terrifying. And we see the same in Carthage. This is the Carthaginian Great Harbour. The round one is the biggest building ever erected to house galleys in the ancient world. The square one is the harbour they used to make money. Remember, Carthage is literally a city on the edge of Africa. It has no territory. It's basically a motorway service station halfway between Tyre and Cadiz, which is the great trade route of the Phoenicians. When Tyre is taken over by the Mesopotamians, Carthage goes independent. It's a trade-centered republic. It's not a military republic. It has no land, it has no population. It has to hire mercenary armies. And eventually it will come to Spain and build an army in Spain for the Second Punic War. The Barcid dynasty, for whom the city is named, they come to Spain to raise troops. Not to defeat Rome, because Rome is too big and strong, but to build a grand coalition to restrain Rome from becoming a universal monarchy. Hannibal fails in that quest, and ultimately Carthage is utterly destroyed because the Romans are petrified not of their military strength, but of the ideas that they represent. Inclusive, merchant-led democratic processes. Roman landed elites do not want to deal with this, so they obliterate it quite literally. They say they plowed salt into the ground. They didn't. They just knocked the place down and left it. As a warning to others, don't do this because we will destroy you. And then we come to the modern world, Venice. If you've seen this, you've been to Venice. It's the Arsenale, the greatest naval station in the early modern world, built by the Venetians, inspired by the Athenians. Everything the Venetians do at sea is referencing the wisdom of the ancient world. The Venetians are processing that because they're on the edge of the Byzantine Empire. If you've been in the Cathedral San Marco, that's a Byzantine church. It's not a Catholic church. That's a Greek Orthodox church. What they're saying is we are operating between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East, and we're getting access. All of Venetian, in this huge arsenale, they're mass-producing galleys. How? Same way the Athenians did it. They've got their hands on the information to process that. They're controlling trade. They're controlling trade routes. They're building island empires which are essentially naval bases. If you go to a Venetian former imperial territory, you'll find a fortified harbour with ship sheds in it to service galleys. Couldn't be more obvious. And they're able to do this on a mud bank at the top end of the Adriatic with almost no land. Venice is a very maritime republic, and it achieves enormous power through wealth and through a form of oligarchic democracy which enables them to remain stable for a very long time. Unlike the Athenians and the Carthaginians who were destroyed, the Venetians decline into mediocrity in the 18th century, but Napoleon, who really doesn't like these ideas, goes along and destroys the place anyway. When Napoleon arrives in Venice, he burns the great symbols of the sea power state. Because he's read Livy, he understands what the Romans did, and he is the new Roman emperor. So he rubs out the Carthaginians. Turner's reference to the Carthaginians is that Napoleon called the British the Carthaginians. His picture of the defeat of the rise of the Carthaginian Empire is hanging in a London exhibition all the way through the Waterloo campaign. And the picture says something very simple. We are the new Carthaginians, and this time we won. It's a celebration of British victory. It's painted in 1814, it's exhibited in 1815, and if you're in London waiting for news of Waterloo, that's the picture right at the centre of the big public exhibit that year. Couldn't be more obvious. He had no idea what Carthage looked like, he made it up, but it's a great picture. And he painted it not to sell, like most artists, he painted it for the nation. He left it to the National Gallery, and it still hangs in exactly the place that he specified. He said it should hang there opposite a picture by Claude Lorraine. It's a really important piece of culture. Yeah? Not just a picture, but the whole process around it. Obviously, we're in Catalonia, and what I want to do is to raise an example to ponder on. Sea power, great powers are very few. I've mentioned 3 of them, there are 2 more to come. But there are also sea states, smaller states that focus on the sea and become significantly more powerful than they would do if they focused on the land. The one that I always look at is Genoa, rival of Venice, but never really fully secure. The Genoese were always being invaded by the French or the Spanish or both, and the Milanese as well. So ultimately, Genoa, under Andrea Doria, who commanded the King of Spain's galley fleet, becomes a subcontractor to the Habsburg Spanish monarchy. And Andrea Doria will command the fleets of Philip II and Charles V. And this picture is very significant because it's the only picture of a great head of state in this period without a single piece of gold on display. This is a very canny operator. He's selling the state fleet to the Spanish for a fee, and that fee is his because he actually owns the ships. And the thing that really should strike you is his right hand. It's a long, thin, bony hand stretching out to grab the money. Yeah. The Genoese will tell you the Spanish went to the Americas, they found gold, it traveled to Spain, but it got buried in a Genoese bank. Yeah. And Genoese names are all over Spanish America. They took over from a role that the Catalans had had earlier on as the great maritime arm of the Habsburg Empire. The penultimate sea power state is the Dutch Republic, and that's also highly relevant. The Dutch will fight an 80-year-long war of independence against the Habsburg Empire. And that war is funded by dynamic, expansive global trade. The Dutch are making money out of being the universal carriers of world trade. They are expanding the network of world trade all the way out to what we would now call Indonesia, and indeed China and Japan. They're highly aggressive merchants, they're also highly aggressive militarily, and their campaign to remove Spanish control from the Low Countries is largely amphibious. They're fighting at sea, they're fighting on rivers, they're fighting on lakes, and they're able to secure their independence because they end up using water as a means of defending themselves. So highly effective. What does Dutch sea power look like? Looks like this. The ship in the middle with its stern to you is the Golden Lion. It's a famous old Dutch flagship. It's on its way to the breaker's yard in this picture, because this is after the Dutch Republic has essentially given up being a sea power state. But Amsterdam Harbour is still packed with trade. The Dutch remain very rich, but they cease to be a sea power, great power, early in the 18th century. They simply can't afford it anymore because they have a common border with countries that will invade them with large armies, in this case, in the 1670s, France. The French invasion conquers half of the Dutch Republic and forces those members of the Dutch Republic, and remember there are 7 provinces, 3 of them have no coast and they're not rich. They want to build a big army and defend the country against the French. Holland and Zeeland, the maritime provinces, want to concentrate on the sea and the fleet. And that's a huge battle. And it's a battle between the republican, democratic elements and the monarchical, authoritarian elements. And it's resolved in favor of the monarchy by the French. The French create the situation in which the Dutch have to abandon their ambition to focus on the sea because of their continental security concerns. Having a land border makes it much harder. Being an island is really attractive. You could be a strategic island like the United States, which faces no threats on its borders, or you can be a real island like the United Kingdom. But if you have serious continental borders, you have serious continental problems, and that's going to draw off your resources, your military strength. It's going to force you into non-productive activity. Remember, a navy is primarily a trade protection asset. It also fights battles. But the navy of states like Russia, Soviet Union, these are not trade protection assets. They're simply military forces. And their main ambition is to project power onto the land. It's not to defend maritime communications. You can tell a lot about a country by looking at its great battles. What are the battles that really matter in the history of Britain? Defeat of the Spanish Armada, 1588, Trafalgar, 1805, Battle of the Atlantic, Second World War. They all have one thing in common. They all fought at sea. They're all about sea communications. When Montesquieu came to London in the 1720s, 30s, he was trying to understand how it was that the English, of all people, had defeated Louis XIV. The Grand Monarch was meant to be the new Roman Emperor, and if you've seen any pictures of Louis XIV, he's dressing up like a Roman Emperor with a wig on. That's the only giveaway. Very small man, high-heeled shoes, huge wig, 5'2" probably at best, but once dressed up, a bit taller. Louis wants to be the man. He wants to rule the whole of Europe. He wants to create a universal pan-Roman empire. The British and the Dutch will stop him. They burn his fleet. They subsidize his enemies. They block his attempt to punch into Germany. They block his attempt to take over the Dutch Republic. They keep him out of even what is now modern Belgium. So it's that standoff between 2 different forms of power that's really important. And that's where the cultural element of this becomes hugely important. Once you understand that we're looking at a cultural difference, which is absolutely fundamental, everything else falls into place. For the French, military success is an army. For the English, it's a navy. If you're in the middle of London, which square are you in? You're in Trafalgar Square. And if you want to know why you're in Trafalgar Square, there's a statue right up on top of the Roman column, which celebrates the British victory. Essentially, Trafalgar Square says a very simple thing: we are the masters of the universe, and if you don't know why, there's a statue. And if you walk a mile down the road to St. Paul's Cathedral, and you stand under the crossing of the cathedral, you are standing right next to Nelson's tomb. And he is at the epicenter of a whole crypt full of heroic dead British soldiers and sailors. But he is the British hero. He is the defining emblem of that approach. Montesquieu says, essentially, how is it that this Carthaginian republic has defeated Louis XIV? That's what L'Esprit de Loi is all about. What went wrong with France? Why did France failed? We should have dealt with these people. They're not very big, they're not very numerous, they're actually quite often at each other's throats. How did they win? Well, the answer is they used a different strategic model and they challenged the norm and they were successful. Only because it was possible to use the sea in ways that had not been possible in Northern Europe for a long time. Dutch and British sea power state identity depends on 3-masted sailing ships which can cross oceans. depends on improved cannon. If you haven't got a weapon system that will sink other people's ships, you can't use the sea effectively. Triremes sink ships. The ancient galley warfare is decisive. By the 17th century, the English and the Dutch have developed naval warfare to a point where you can stop invasions with a fleet. In the Middle Ages, in Northern Europe, you can't stop an invasion. England is invaded over and over and over again. We change our government every 10, 15 years, either exiles, foreign powers. As soon as you get a gun-armed, decisive battle fleet, and this is what Henry VIII does. He creates a navy, he builds a fleet, he puts some castles in the key positions, and he makes Britain into a sea power state, and he allows it to disengage with Europe. And that's a conscious decision taken early in his reign, when the Habsburgs come to dominate not just in Spain, but also in Northern Europe. The Habsburgs are dominating Northern European trade, and the English are very aware of this and are pulling back. That's what Thomas More's Utopia is all about. It's about trade negotiations in Brussels with the Habsburgs. Alfred T. Mahan. Mahan, as an American, can't write about sea power, one word, as a cultural identity, because the United States is not a sea power. It's far too big, it's far too powerful, and it's just an irrelevant question. So what Mahan does is he takes one word, and the original Greek is one word, thalassokratia, the power of the sea, and he splits it into two. He makes a phrase of it. Sea power, Mahan style, two words, is strategy. Using the sea for strategic advantage. And the Americans will use the sea to expand their empire. 1898, the expense of Spain, taking away Cuba and the Philippines. And again, in the First and Second World Wars, they will use sea power to move their strength to places where they can achieve effect. But American sea power is about taking power and deploying it in somebody else's continent. It's not about securing the seas. American naval officers have no legal training. They cannot enforce the law of the sea. They have to get the Coast Guard on board for that, or the British. British naval officers have always been trained in the enforcement of the law of the sea, because in a sea power state, there's a synergy between trade, expansion, navy. In the United States, there isn't. The United States has no ocean-going merchant shipping. So why would you be bothered to enforce the law on the open oceans? It's not a relevant question. So not all navies are the same. They're far more varied than armies. All armies do national security, they do defense of realm, they occasionally do overseas things. All navies are different. Depends on the state. The state shapes the navy and gets the navy it wants. Mahan's sea power is strategy, it's not identity. By contrast to Julian Corbett, saw it as strategy, policy, and identity. And he pointed out that men live on the land, and therefore you needed to work all the harder, both strategically and culturally, to establish why the sea mattered. The sea matters because it's the only option you have. He's not saying it's impossible. He's saying we are a weak offshore sea power state. We have to think very carefully about strategy. We can't allow our strategy to be divided. When he's writing, the army wants to go and fight in Europe, like the Germans or the French. The Navy wants to do global security, and getting them two together is critical because the Army is the means by which you enhance your sea control. The British Army's main mission is destroying other people's naval bases. Cadiz, 1598. The British land, they burn the dockyard, they sink the fleet, and they go home. Spanish fleet is not coming for a while. 1855, Crimean War. The British capture Sevastopol, sink the fleet, and destroy the dockyard. The Russian Navy is not coming back for a long time. That's what the Royal Navy uses the Army for. It is, as Sir Jackie Fisher pointed out, a projectile to be fired by the Navy. The Navy leads, the Army is deployed from the sea, but it's the Navy first. So Corbett recognizes that strategy has a strong theoretical base. We think, in his case, particularly of the works of Clausewitz, but it's ultimately a matter of national choice. And the best guide to current thinking is found in national experience. So you need to capture history and process it. You can't borrow other people's strategy because it's like other people's boots. It doesn't fit. Your strategy has to be the strategy that suits your purpose, that reflects your experience and develops your ideas. If you borrow other people's, as many people do, you will end up making very bad mistakes. The British did in 1914, as I'll point out. It's a cultural construct. You know, it's not a simple scientific logic, it's a cultural construct. Your strategy has to fit who you are, otherwise it's completely worthless. Corbett also understood that history has to be taken seriously as part of that debate. You can't just simply hoover up some history and throw it at the past. You have to understand the history and you have to use serious scholarly methods. Corbett is a lawyer by training and he understands the difference between evidence and hearsay. And in English court, that really matters. Evidence is something you can prove. So accurate history is the basis of sound strategy. Inaccurate history leads to poor conclusions. So as a historian, I judge work by its quality, but also by its danger. Poor work leads to bad conclusions. Yep. One of those poor conclusions was at the beginning of August 1914, when the First World War breaks out. A small group of English ministers, 4 of them, are in a room with 9 generals and 1 admiral, and they're going to decide how to wage the First World War. You'd think they'd have had a plan. They did, but they abandoned it. And Winston Churchill, the Navy Minister, First Lord of the Admiralty, pipes up immediately and says, we must send the army to France. Churchill, of course, isn't a naval man. He's a junior army officer. He's a cavalryman as well, so impulsive and prone to relying on other brains for his safety. And this is a very poor decision. It's applauded by all the soldiers who want to be proper continental soldiers, not British soldiers. British soldiers understand that they are part of the British war effort. These people seem to think they're part of the French war effort. And that's what they become. They become part of the French army. For the first time in British history, British soldiers are fighting under French command. As a result, the strategic impact of the Navy on the war is greatly reduced. It doesn't have that strike force, that projectile. It should have been used to open the Baltic. It should have been used for a number of big issues. It's not used. And as a result, the British fight 2 wars. They control the world ocean, they use naval power, but they're not able to push through into the Baltic where they could end the war by blockading Germany. This is the location of the Committee of Imperial Defense, which Sir Julian Corbett is a member of. Oh, next one. Yeah. So this place here, Whitehall Gardens, that's where the Committee of Imperial Defense operates, and just across the road is Downing Street. Just up that way is the Admiralty building, and just along there is the War Office. This is the heart of British government. It's a civil military coordinating body. Senior statesmen, defence chiefs, and an expert secretariat in which Julian Corbett, the strategist, is a critical player. How much longer have I got?
Yeah, well.
Okay. So in 1914, the Royal Navy goes to war without a serious war plan. Its strike force is taken away. By the end of that year, the First Sea Lord, the senior naval officer, has been removed and replaced by the veteran Admiral Sir John Fisher, Lord Fisher, who had revitalised the Royal Navy early in the 20th century, created the Dreadnought, greatly expanded the range of officer recruitment. So he made it socially far less exclusive to be a naval officer. Fisher comes back with a naval plan which he and Corbett have been working on for at least 15 years, which is to persuade the Germans to invade Denmark. So here is a map of Denmark. The green ink is important. In Britain, the man who writes on things in green ink is the First Sea Lord. These are Fisher's comments. What Fisher is suggesting is that the expeditionary force, the British Army, should be brought to the coast of Belgium. It should liberate the Belgian coast to remove German submarine bases from Ostend and Zeebrugge. And then in 1916, when the Royal Navy has built a specialist fleet to operate in the Baltic, it should be ready, waiting to support the Danes. The Royal Navy would then threaten to enter the Baltic. He fully assumed the German army would march into Denmark. The British army would then be landed on the Danish islands of Zeeland and Funen. That's the 2 big ones between Sweden and the Jutland Peninsula. And if they hold those islands, the Baltic is open, the blockade of Germany is complete, and with Russian allies operating in the rest of the Baltic and providing bases, Britain will now command Germany's coast. The blockade will probably defeat Germany inside 6 months. This is a war-winning strategy. Churchill, as Navy Minister, refuses to entertain it because he doesn't want to remove the army from France. The Prime Minister refuses to table it to the War Cabinet, and so Fisher resigns. In the process, he brings down the government and leads to the creation of a wartime coalition. But this strategy is not carried through, and it's an option which reflects Britain's long-term strategic experience. The failure of this initiative shows a woeful lack of understanding on the part of the political leadership and indeed of the military leadership. The result is that Britain suffered over 1 million casualties in the First World War and paid an awful price for being at war with Germany for 5 years. War could have been significantly shortened by using serious strategic advice. The plan was written up by Sir Julian Corbett, who was the leading strategist of the age, and yet it wasn't even tabled. Next. So, Corbett also wrote the founding draft of the League of Nations, and he defeated American attempts to prevent economic warfare at sea. So one of the 14 points that Woodrow Wilson threw up in his plan to end the war is absolute freedom of the seas. Basically, the ability of America to continue trading with belligerents on both sides without being interfered with by anybody else. Essentially, people in America, like the Chicago meat packers and the southern cotton growers, wanted to sell their goods to the Germans, who'd mobilized all their farm boys and had run out of food. The British stopped them, and the Americans had to fall into line. Corbett's arguments won that battle, and he shaped a League of Nations that would be essentially a security element with a large maritime dimension. Quickly. What does sea power look like today? Well, here are the Americans with a super-duper jet fighter and a not-so-super-duper destroyer, which doesn't actually work very well. There's not a very successful design, being modified as we speak. The Americans are having a standoff with the Chinese, 2 Chinese warships in the foreground, the Americans in the background. Are they going to fight? No, the Chinese aren't coming out to fight. They're putting up, I think, a very brave face, but they're not coming out to fight because it's not just the Americans they would have to fight. They would have a hard job dealing with Japan and Korea. Next. So, maritime power is shaped by location, culture, political structures, and economic opportunity, not size or population. It's conscious choice, and it's a constructed identity. It's not a mere fact of geography. Many countries could be sea powers, but only a few chose to do so. Contemporary sea state populations, you can work that out for yourselves. Yeah. Next. That's just a statement to say the Danes are putting a lot more money into their navy as we speak. Massive upgrade for their navy. Next. Of course, Denmark is the home of one of the world's great container shipping lines, Maersk, who are moving into a green future with hydrogen-fueled container ships built in South Korea. But all of this is linked to a massive dependence on the sea as the primary element of their economic development. Denmark's place in the European Union is very significant, but its place in the world economy is even more important. Denmark is building new frigates, it's building new sea control assets of exactly the type that you would need to protect that shipping. So Denmark sees the sea, it sees itself in the sea, and if you want to talk to Europeans who really get the ocean inside the EU, the Danes and the Dutch are your go-to people. Now the British have left. But it has to be a whole of government, a whole of nation approach. It can't be something you tack on the edge of. The Navy shouldn't be over there, it should be right in the middle. So the Royal Navy is expanding for the 21st century. It has 2 large deck aircraft carriers with some of those fancy American fighters on. But also, it is global. This is the Royal Navy Battle Group in the South China Sea in 2021. There's a Dutch frigate right astern of the British aircraft carrier, and alongside, and just further into the picture, is an American destroyer. During that sortie around the world, not only did the British take the Americans and the Dutch with them, but they did cross-deck carrier operations with the Americans and the Japanese, and one of the British frigates sailed through the Taiwan Straits in a freedom of navigation operation. British destroyers sailed around the territorial waters of the Ukraine in the Crimea, much to the consternation of the Russians only a year before the current crisis. So, thank you very much. Essentially, sea power states are a critical element in the development of world history, and they are a serious option for those who are thinking about being different and the opportunities that that might throw up in the future. Thank you very much.
Plenty of time. 45 minutes for
Yep.
Q&A.
Good.
I will start.
Yep. Great.
Well, thank you, Professor Lambert. So we'll start with the Q&A, but before that, the first broadside. It's about, well, being Catalonia a country with a big maritime past. Despite being Caribbean, we have a Mahanian issue, because that is named the sea blindness. Which will be your advice to the decision makers, entrepreneurs, companies to overcome this sea blindness?
Yes. We've had this debate in Britain, sea blindness, and you think, really? The British? Yes, everybody has sea blindness. It's not a lack of ability to see, it's a completely oblivious forgetfulness. If it's not put in front of people over and over and over again, people forget. How can the British forget this? In the Second World War, and indeed in the First World War, Britain was absolutely dependent, as it always is, on imported food and raw materials. Everybody who was living in Britain in the World Wars understood just how important it was. But as soon as the war is over and the goods start flowing and the food isn't in question, everybody forgets. And then Vladimir Putin reminded us last year, it really is important. He threatened to cut off all kinds of things, and everybody, oh right, that's really important. So sea blindness isn't a lack of vision, it's a lack of focus. We're not seeing this because it's not up front, in front of us. It's not hitting us in the face day after day. If it is, it goes away very quickly. So sea blindness is best countered by reality. And the second best way is to make sure people understand their history. So how many people in Britain fully understand what's going on in the Battle of the Atlantic in the Second World War? Not many. It couldn't be more important. Without victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, the British lose the war. The war would have been over long before the Americans joined. The Americans would have found it difficult to be effective in the war at all. So it's really important that when we're looking at the past, we make sure that we include all of it, we get the things that really matter, and the sea is critical. So for some countries, the sea doesn't matter because they don't have a coast, but it still impacts them. The sea is impacting everybody. And making sure that you've got that story. This is what history does. It tells you these things over and over again. And if you forget to tell those stories, and you tell them as fact, you tell them as fiction, you tell them as art, you tell them in buildings, you find ways of making sure that nobody is able to forget this. And that's a conscious, political, economic, intellectual effort. So the answer is you have to work harder. There isn't any other simple answer. The obvious way to make sea blindness go away is a war or a crisis, and we'd rather not have too many of those, so we're going to have to work harder. That's one of the things that I was trying to do in the book, is to get people to see that this is not optional for some countries. Some countries can just abandon it, but for many it's not optional. They do have to do this. And when they're tested, if their systems aren't strong and the support for it is not coherent, it goes away. How do you get people to pay for a navy? Well, you have to explain to them why it's important. Everybody just assumes you probably need an army, but navy, do you need one of those? It's kind of, how much impact does the navy have economically in your region? If you go to America, they'll tell you, in Virginia, if they stopped building nuclear aircraft carriers, the state would go bankrupt. So one American state absolutely depends on this. And that F-35 fighter, it's built in 35 different American states. So that's called sharing out the profits. Oh, and the one that does vertical takeoff, the middle bit is built in Britain with the engine that lifts it off the deck. So it's 36 states. Yeah? That's how you make it relevant. Yeah, you make it relevant by making everybody engaged in the project. You sell it. 100 years ago, we'd have had a league of school children who'd been indoctrinated and would carry the message forward. We don't do that now, but we've got to find ways of getting that message out there and keeping it out there. So it's the relationship between those ideas, the means of promoting those ideas, the means of expanding people's horizons so they do look out to sea, beyond the surf line, and think about what's happening out there all of the time. You know, these days, the only time we hear about the sea is when there's something tragically goes wrong. When a ship sinks, everybody's horrified. Ship sink? Really? Yes, they do. If you don't use them properly, they sink. If you make mistakes, they sink. If they're not well built, they sink. So that's you've got to get it into the core of the argument, because if it's out on the margins, it will have no effect and you will lose the argument. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I have a thing in my head. I always want to learn one new thing every day, and I learned about 5 here, so I'm well ahead. So thank you very much for that, and I'm sure other people have learned as well. I just have 2 questions, and of course I'm speaking as an absolute amateur here, because I know very little about this, and I also have an observation. So I'll start with the observation where you said that you have to remind people of this all the time, and you had a picture of a Danish warship, I don't know if it's a frigate or whatever it is, with Niels Juel. And it's interesting that there's a statue of the man Niels Juel just in front of the Danish Parliament. So I'm assuming that all the Danish school children, we've reminded every time. So just an interesting thing that you probably knew already. Now, I'm currently based in Australia, and in Australia, they are panicked about the Chinese. And so I think I'm assuming they're spending money on this, and I think they are now with AUKUS and everything. But you said that you think the Chinese are not going to fight. I'm thinking, you're probably saying about over Taiwan, and you say because they would have to fight the Japanese and the Koreans as well. I'd like to expand on that. And then I wanted to clear up a fact. Somebody said that the Chinese, until recently, didn't have a single aircraft carrier, which I thought that can't be right. Is that a new thing that the Chinese have built that up? Because my understanding is that the Chinese actually have recovered from sea blindness and may be, so yes, basically that. And then I suppose lastly, sorry if I'm taking time, but I just found it fascinating, spending time in Papua New Guinea, and somebody said, well, would Britain be a country that could be involved in the independence movement in Bougainville, because they had a referendum, it's like a Catalan-like situation, and the Australian High Commissioner said, no, Britain doesn't have an interest in this area, and I protested, as I think I ought to, having my British passport. So is Britain basically projecting itself more, especially after Brexit? We've become sort of Norway with nukes and submarines and so on. So on Papua New Guinea, is that part of our sphere of interest? And the questions about the Chinese. Sorry, that's rambling order there.
No, that all fits together very well. The Danes have several naval hero statues in the middle of Copenhagen. And if you're in the middle of Copenhagen, you're standing right next to the sea, and you can see the naval base for their 18th, 19th century navy with many of its buildings still standing. If you're in Copenhagen, you are on the sea in the middle of the world's largest concentration of sea influence that you could possibly imagine. The Maersk building is there. Maersk paid for the new Danish opera house. Mr. Maersk didn't like the look of it. He asked them not to build it exactly there, because it's right in front of his office windows. But they did anyway, because they're Danish, and those with the Scandinavian heritage know that being awkward is essential. Australia, China, the Australians have been worried about somebody from Asia invading their country for the last 200 years, including the Russians, who obviously are an Asiatic power as well as a a Eurasian power. The Russians have a big naval base at Vladivostok with nuclear submarines in it. If you want to know why the Japanese Navy is good, that's the basic answer. The Japanese have been responsible for tailing all Russian ballistic missile submarines leaving Vladivostok since about 1970. And they do the same to the Chinese ballistic missile submarines today that exit from Hainan Island. They have 22 brand new super-duper diesel-electric submarines with air-independent propulsion. They are exceptionally capable. Because they don't call it a navy, it's the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force under the 1945 treaty. Don't forget, these are the heirs of the men who fought in the Second World War, and there's a lot of the old Japanese Navy in the modern self-defense force. It's a very, very high-quality navy with exceptionally good equipment levels and very long endurance times at sea, which I think would put most European navies to shame. The Chinese would have a hard job dealing with the Japanese Navy once you get into the area where the Japanese would fight. The Chinese have 3 aircraft carriers, hooray. One of them is something the Soviets were building in the 1980s, which the Ukrainians sold them. Why hasn't Russia built a new aircraft carrier? Because the shipyard's in the Ukraine, it's at Mykolaiv. There isn't another shipyard in the old Soviet Union that can build aircraft carriers, so they haven't built one. They talk about it all the time. Putin, coming from St. Petersburg, is obsessed with the Navy. It's a hometown thing, but they can't actually build one. They're currently mending their early 1980s aircraft carrier, which is a wreck, because they can't build a new one. The Chinese then built a copy of the one they bought from the Ukrainians, and they've now built something which looks a bit like what the Soviets were going to build after that. Not one of them is anything like an American aircraft carrier. They are relatively small, they don't go anywhere, and to the best of my knowledge, they don't fly many planes off, and when they do, they don't have any weapons or stores on board, and possibly not even a full fuel load. Yeah. Landing an Su-27 on a short flight deck is not easy, and it's certainly not something for people who are only doing it as part of national service. The Russians trained pilots for their first aircraft carrier and kept them in service for 25 years, planes and pilots. And they've sort of run out now. You know, people of my age shouldn't be flying jet fighters off aircraft carriers. So the Papua New Guinea question raises 2 things. Why are the Chinese interfering in somebody else's backyard? Well, they want basing rights, they want access to trade, particularly minerals. The answer to the question is Hambantota, which is the port in Sri Lanka that the Chinese bankrolled, and they're now making the Sri Lankans pay for it, even though it's utterly useless. The Sri Lankan government agreed to build this project. They were loaned the money, they can't pay it back, their economy has collapsed. So what are the Chinese going to do with a naval base on the coast of somebody else's country, right in the middle of the maritime Silk Road? Perhaps they're going to use it. Oh, and why do they have a base at Djibouti as well? Why have they bought half the harbour in the Piraeus? We have to hope that the current downturn in the Chinese economy will lead them to pull their money back from some of these overseas investments and perhaps think about the situation at home. Nothing has ever changed. China has surged into the world and withdrawn from it constantly. You'll probably be familiar with the famous exploring voyages of Cheng Ho in the 14th century. He went all the way down the coast of Africa and took some giraffes home to show the emperor. Everybody thinks this is a wonderful voyage of discovery. It's kind of Christopher Columbus, but the other way around. It's not. Cheng Ho was sent out to find the deposed ex-emperor and just make sure that the person they thought they'd murdered was actually dead, and to destroy expatriate Chinese communities of traders who were subverting the tribute system. As you know, all countries around China are meant to go to Beijing and kowtow and give gifts. Those with expatriate Chinese trading communities weren't doing this, so they got wiped out. Because in China, if you live outside China, you don't count. You know, in Europe, we tend to think that our nationals living abroad are still ours. But in China, you don't count. It doesn't, and of course you don't get a vote in an independence referendum either, obviously, if you're living abroad. So we have to be very careful about what we think China is about. The Chinese are very worried. They're worried about those things that worried the Spartans and the Persians. Inclusive democracy, anybody? Liberalization on the agenda anytime soon? Probably not. So Japan does have a first-class navy. China has a large navy, but it's not first class. I would put money on them not coming out and certainly not fighting. And what are they doing in New Guinea? Annoying the Australians. Is it any of Britain's business? Well, we have to talk to the Australians about this because it's their backyard. It would be like us interfering in a discussion between the Channel Islands and mainland UK from Australia. The Australians are our partners out there. We're doing a big deal with them. We're going to help them build a nuclear submarine fleet. So I think we'll probably have to let them take the lead on this. That's what you do with allies. When the thing is more important to them than it is to you, you can talk to them quietly, but you really shouldn't say anything in public until you've got everything agreed.
Hello, thank you very much. I've never been very interested in the Navy. I'm now fascinated. I will throw myself at every book on Navy I will find. I'm going to drag you back to Catalonia, if you don't mind.
No, I'm in Catalonia.
You mentioned and you made a comparison, the population of Catalonia with Denmark, like sort of, hey, hey.
Yep.
And Singapore.
Yep.
Thank you. The thing is that when Catalonia was a naval power, the center of the world was the Mediterranean. We now have a coast on the Mediterranean, and it's no longer the center of the world. And the place to be, let's say, are the oceans. So to what extent is this, it possibly explains our character and the way we like to function, but to what extent is it a lesson to learn and to apply? In other words, how much can we actually invest in saying, right, we want to make ourselves great in some way. Do we really have an option of making it via sea power?
Yes, thank you very much. That's an excellent argument. Denmark isn't on the world ocean either. They sit at a choke point between a totally enclosed sea, the Baltic, and the North Sea, which is also very small. So for the Danes to trade with the world, they've got to go out of the Baltic, out of the North Sea, into the Atlantic, and if they're going all the way around to China, they've got to go through the Indian Ocean, South China Sea, and bits of the Pacific. So they're trading with the other side of the world out of a base which is further away from Asia than Catalonia. If you have the right size ships, you can go from Catalonia through the Suez Canal, it's been widened, or you can go out through the Straits of Gibraltar and do the other route if you've got even bigger ships. So location is less important. I think the connectivity that you have here with the rest of Europe is at least as good as that of the Danes. Yeah? So it's, I think it's a valid model, but it is going to be a conscious choice in much the same way that the Danish choice. What the Danes are doing is marking themselves out as not being continentalist Europeans. And I think that's the core argument. We see the world because we're trading with it. Our great companies are international, global, not local, regional, continental. And that's something that, coming from Britain, I see very much as a historian of Britain in the 19th century in particular. Britain sees Europe as largely a problem to be monitored in the 19th century. Between Waterloo and the First World War, the British don't send any troops into Western Europe at all. They manage to monitor and moderate and quite often avoid major conflicts. So there are several occasions when the French look like they're going to start a major war and the British step in and persuade people to back down. They also, in 1870, persuade the Prussians and the French not to invade Belgium because Belgium really matters to the British. So it's getting those strategic priorities, those political and economic priorities, and making fairly clear choices. I don't think Catalonia is any worse placed than Denmark. Singapore is perfectly placed because it is literally on the axis between East and West. And it was always a trade hub. The British created it as a trade hub to control the Straits of Malacca, which are hugely important then and now. And the Singaporeans have half a dozen brand new submarines. Now, what you imagine they might want to use those for at some stage in the future? Who might be coming through the Malacca Straits with hostile intent, who they might need to sink? I've taught several Singaporean officers, and they're very good. They're very good indeed, very well trained. So location is important, but think about what that location gives you in terms of onward reach. How does one location fit into larger locations? Who would you be trading with? What are the commodities that you might end up trading in? Because most of these great shipping companies tend to specialize. Containers are an obvious thing, but there are other trades as well. So building a particular agenda, one that evolves out of an understanding of location, place, and opportunity, I think that's critical. And that is going to build an identity, and that's a weapon which can be used for many things, including tourism, but we can think of other things you might want to use it for.
I have two questions. The first one is if Catalonia, I will say first one, Catalonia countries could be influent in the Mediterranean Sea, actually, yeah. And if that's possible, how should be the navy from Catalonia countries?
Yep. Lovely, thank you very much. I think the critical thing is to make sure that this project sees the sea in the round. So we need to think about shipbuilding, we need to think about insurance, we need to think about trade links, we need to think about the port infrastructure. How much port infrastructure would you need to become a major competitor to somewhere like Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Antwerp, the great trade hubs of Northern Europe? Is there more that could be done there? Can you attract more business by building more infrastructure? Can you generate a greater maritime economic base by expanding in key areas? And both the Dutch and the British create a virtuous, almost perfect circle in which trade expands because government supports it with a navy and tax measures, and that increase in trade then funds a larger navy, which enables you to control more sea area, which enables you to expand your trade. So by the middle of the 19th century, Britain owns nearly 3/4 of global ocean-going shipping. It insures and manages even more. We heard this morning about Norway. Norway is invited to become independent because the British already control the Norwegian shipbuilding and shipping industry. Because Norway has very little export or import trade, it is a service provider. When the Germans invade Norway in 1940, they give the British 12 million tons of shipping. They're not going to sink 12 million tons of shipping until the middle of 1942. So by invading Norway, the Germans lose the Battle of the Atlantic. If they ever had any hope of winning it, they needed those ships not to be working for the British. Oh, and that dumb Danish prince who ended up as the king of Norway, who was his wife? She was the daughter of King Edward VII of England, who set up the whole project. So in the Second World War, the king of Norway is half British. And where does he go when the Germans invade? Well, he and his gold reserves go straight to London. So you build those links in many different ways: cultural links, political links, economic links. And the British had been going to Norway a lot in the 19th century. The British have a Viking moment, sort of 1870, 1880. They get very excited about Norway. So when the Norwegians say, "Can we be independent?" most people in Britain think that's a great idea because they've been to Norway, they've not been to Sweden, and when the Norwegians say the Swedes are really bad, and they treat the British say, "Okay," And because they're seafaring and they've got this big merchant industry which is geared into the London marine insurance market and the London shipbuilding market, we know these people. They're honorary Englishmen. Works the other way around now. I find I'm accused of being an honorary Norwegian when I go there. But then most of my ancestors were indeed Norwegians. So it's about creating a navy which can service those needs. So the basis of your navy is that you've got expanding trade, you've got an expanding area in which you wish to operate, and you identify the security threats. They're not necessarily national, they can be non-national actors. We might call them pirates historically, but anybody who's doing bad things at sea, that is a service that you provide in exchange for the income and revenue that those shipping companies are generating on your turf. So that's how it all works. British shipping didn't conquer the world by being really clever. It conquered the world by having an awful lot of naval support, so it didn't get pirated. And once you've got that, you've got a premium, and that allows you to operate more effectively. So British ships sail in the Mediterranean in the 17th century, particularly the 18th century, without any guns, because all the bad guys in the Mediterranean know that if they attack a British ship, there'll be a price to pay. Other states do not do that, and their ships are pirated and their crews are enslaved. Barbary corsairs would pick on anybody, but not a British ship. British ship would always have a pass, which basically said in Arabic, attack this ship at your peril, we'll come and sort you out afterwards. They left them alone. So it was everybody else. The Scandinavians paid a tax, so the Danes were paying what we in England would call Dangeld, basically a bribe, to stop the Algerians and the Tunisians from pirating their ships. The British didn't have to do that, so their ships traveled cheaper, and they could undercut the rates of their competitors. So the nation, by having a big navy, was doing them a great service. The Algerians learned this lesson in the 1650s. They pirated some English ships. The English sailed into their harbour and sank their entire fleet. They didn't mess with us again for a long time. So that's the kind of dynamic. You're selling the navy not because it's a nice thing to have, because it's a necessary thing to have, and it gives you real advantages. Our navy still makes all of our charts. What are charts for? Well, avoiding hitting things. That's economically very attractive. So the security you get from all of these engagements, and you can build that up from a low base. You don't have to start with a whole navy. You can start by doing something really well, and people will like that, and they will start to buy into the project. So any particular part of the maritime domain where you can give your locals an advantage, that's a positive step, and you can build on that.
Thank you very much. Fascinating, really. You've laid out a wonderful theory of how this virtuous cycle works. I was wondering, it seems like almost a universal constant that economic growth primarily comes from trade through seas or in seas. So, and this seems to me almost the same in Greek times and nowadays. So if that's the case, when is it then that land-based powers end up having an advantage? I mean, we've got a land power to worry about ourselves. So did the Dutch, and so did many others. And so, in your theory, that seems to have no space that land powers would rise and really threaten smaller sea-based power. So if you could say a word about that, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important question. Land powers are there before the sea powers. Land power is normal, sea power is abnormal. So a sea power is a state that cannot compete with a land power in land terms and has to use a different methodology. All they can hope to do is to get an asymmetric advantage and use that to reduce the threat. But the history of sea power states is they have all ultimately, one way or another, been ground down and defeated by land powers. So it's not a permanent recipe for success. So I wouldn't bet everything on this for the long term. Short term, medium term, some centuries you can get away with this, but all of them ultimately were destroyed in one way or another by continental powers. The Venetians, for example, by the war between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. They had to pick sides, and as they traded with the Ottomans, they went with the Ottomans and didn't do them any good. So what the British end up doing by 1914 is having a global empire with enormous human resources. So in the First World War, Britain does fight as a great sea power and also as a great land power. So the British mobilised very large armies, not just in Britain, but also in Canada, in New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and in India. All the fighting in the Middle East that the British do in the First World War against Turkey and Iraq, in Palestine, essentially all coming out of India. Even the British troops who are in those campaigns are based in India and they're operating on Indian resources. So those campaigns for the British are essentially self-sustaining because they're not getting anything from Britain. It's all coming out of India, where the British have been anticipating having to fight the Russians. So Britain becomes a continental power when it acquires control of India. And remember, modern India was constructed by the British. There is no prior Indian imperial state like that. So the British end up with the resources of a land power and a sea power, and that enables them to be effective in the two world wars. But that's a short-term advantage because after the war, all of that goes away. The empire's gone, and very quickly, a lot of the maritime power that went with it goes too. So all of these empires fail, and I tried to underplay that perhaps in the book because I didn't want to end on a low note, but the history of sea power states is they all fail. The Athenian one within 2 generations, the Carthaginians within about 6 generations, the Venetians took a lot longer. But they're ultimately, if the land power wants to win, and they're prepared to do what the Romans did, which is to build navy after navy after navy, because the Romans lost a lot of ships. They just kept going until they'd finally ground the opposition into the dust. The Romans fought at sea like they fought on land. They just didn't give up. They just kept on coming back, and eventually they triumphed. And that's the honest truth is, it's a great thing to do, and it's the greatest thing you can do as a small state, but it's not ultimately going to answer the big state question.
Thank you very much, Professor Lambert. It's always a pleasure listening to you. We're a bit far away from war studies in London, right? We're in Catalonia, a very different situation. You can't compare Catalonia to the British Empire, not even to Denmark, even though our populations are quite similar. Catalonia can't even have a coast guard, right? If we try to rescue 2 swimmers in the sea, let's call a spade, the Spanish Guardia Civil will take over and rescue those 2 swimmers. We can't control our airports, we can't control our ports, so we have a very, very different situation from the examples that you have mentioned, which are all nation states, empires, etc. In view of this, what would you recommend that our political leaders do to create some sort of political naval strategy that is realistic and playable within the current circumstances? That would be my first question. Completely unrelated question, going back to larger strategies. AUKUS and Indo-Pacific Ocean, everything that's going on there. What's happening with, you showed us a picture of an international fleet, and curiously enough, the French battleships were not there, right? You mentioned the Brits, you mentioned the Americans, etc. How do you see the relationship between the French and the other European, American, Western sea powers in that region of the world in view of what is happening with China? Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. I will address those in reverse order because the second question is slightly easier to answer. France, of course, is a Pacific power. It has Pacific territories, and will now it's finished irradiating them. There'll be some compensation to pay for that, I'm sure. France takes that very seriously. France takes its empire very seriously, and I think much of sub-Saharan Africa wishes it didn't. As the popularity of the Wagner organization in several sub-Saharan African countries testifies. There's something about France where imperial grandeur is an essential requirement for presidents. I find Macron and imperial grandeur very difficult to fit together, I must admit, but that's where it is. I think getting France to think more clearly about this would be useful. I think France has an important role to play in the world, but I'm not sure it's playing it at the moment. I think the French are looking for some of that thing that Napoleon liked, la gloire, but without thinking about how they can actually earn it in a way it's useful to everybody else. The British and French do cooperate. We cooperate quite well. We share quite a lot of agendas. We share some technologies. We also don't share technologies. we're building nuclear submarines for the Australians, but we're not working with the French on this project. They have their own project. We don't even exchange information about where our ballistic missile submarines hide. So about 10 years ago, 2 of them collided because they had no idea that we were both using the same deep bit of the Atlantic to park our ballistic missile submarines in. It was a very low-speed collision, but slightly surprising anyway. So I think France is a Pacific power. It has naval assets stationed in the Pacific, but no, they weren't involved in that process. And I think that's the British pointing out who their real friends in the area are. And the Australians, the Japanese, the Americans, the Dutch, Singapore, did a few exercises with the Indian Navy as well. I think it gives you an indication of what the transit lines are. The French are a little eccentric to the main areas of concern in the Pacific in terms of their territory. So political processes for regional governments. I think it's just beefing up anything you can do in the maritime sector at regional level. I think it's just anything. Anything that makes people say, the sea, it's us, it's that synergy. So in the Danish case, it's a national thing and it works really well. You've got a different problem, which is you have regional authority and you have to use the regional levers to build that process. What would be nice, of course, is if some of the national processes were being directed out of this province. If the region was in charge of some aspect of the maritime element of the current state, that would be interesting. Of course, in the Dutch Republic, 4 of the 7 provinces had their own admiralties. They actually ran their own separate navies. The Dutch didn't have a navy until the 18th century. They had separate navies. And there was always a real fist fight between Holland and Zeeland as to who would have the senior admiral. And then there was a fist fight about whether it should be a republican admiral or a monarchist admiral. And the admirals on both sides of this would fight for this honour, often verbally and occasionally with fisticuffs. And it didn't make their navy any more efficient. So look at what can be done regionally and try and build on that. Establish a reputation for competence, professionalism, and attract the industries that are going to increase that footfall. Is there any way that you can regionally draw resources right across the maritime sector into this region and use that as a way of emphasizing that connection? This doesn't have to be sold as a particular political process, but it's an economic process. It's a logical process. You're building on resources, you're building on strength, you're building on history and cultural identity. So make it a very positive play. Not we don't want to be part of that, but we do want to do all of these things here because we have all of these assets. We've got coast, we've got position, we've got asset, we've got investment, we can do all of these things. So make it positive, not a challenge, but a particular focus that gives you some traction.
Yeah. Last one.
Last one, all right.
Hello. Is there an independence process in the contemporary era in which the naval aspect has been like the main focus on the process or conflict of emancipation?
Right, yeah. Has naval activity been the critical element in independence movements? The last major conflict in which naval activity was critical to the outcome of the independence conflict is in Sri Lanka, the Tamil insurgency, or indeed, some people will say the creation of and then suppression of a Tamil state. This relied very heavily on supplies brought in by sea, and a large amount of naval activity at a low level took place. I was involved in dealing with some of the legal issues about rules of engagement, and also talking to Sri Lankan naval officers. If you want to talk to a navy with a lot of combat veterans, that's the one. I think every single Sri Lankan naval officer I've ever met has been wounded in combat. This is close quarters fighting with machine guns in small boats. That's really very unpleasant. So the Sri Lankan Navy's ability to prevent the flow of supplies into the nascent Tamil state was critical. And they were very concerned about rules of engagement because they needed not to get on the wrong side of the Indian government, because much of that shipping is coming out of India, legally or otherwise. And it was very important that they established a very clear rule of engagement in which they would or would not use lethal force. So that would be the example I would look at. And of course, Sri Lanka is an island, and a large chunk of the island was under contest for the Tamils. So that would be the one I would look at. But we're looking at something very significant in the Black Sea at the moment. You're all familiar with the remotely controlled drone craft that the Ukrainians are using. I think that concept came to light within a few hours of the invasion by the Russians. They've been put into production. But also the use of British-supplied missiles to attack the Black Sea headquarters last week. Very significant strike, long-range missile. What are the Ukrainians doing? Well, they're, I think, very intelligently playing a strategic game which will give them great benefits if it works. Their current offensive is driving down towards the main road that links Russia to the Crimea and the other bits of occupied territory. As you're all aware, they've also attacked, but not fully demolished, the Kerch Straits Bridge. I would suggest that if they get down to the main road, or even to within artillery range of the main road through southern Russia into the Crimea, they will take down the Kerch Straits Bridge immediately. And that will put enormous pressure on the Russian occupation of all of that territory. And that would be a very big strategic win. So again, the sea is critical. That narrow piece of water which that bridge flies over can be turned into a barrier quite quickly. In the Crimean War 200 years ago, the British occupied the Sea of Azov and cut off the Russian garrison in Sevastopol from all of their logistics with 12 small gunboats. And that led to the fall of a major Russian fortress. So controlling the sea or denying the sea can be hugely important. And it doesn't look like much because there isn't a great deal of fighting. But the thing we have to remember as historians, critics, analysts, is that what is happening and what we can see, because it's making a lot of noise and there are large dynamic events to be reported, may not be the really important things. So at the moment, what we're looking at is a lot of rather random fighting, but there is a plan in all of this, and hopefully it will all become much clearer later. So don't follow the headlines of history, follow the big trends, follow the main development line, try and find out what is really happening. So much of what we remember as history is when things go wrong, not when things go according to plan. So we remember the chaos, the futility, the tragedy of war, but we don't remember what war is actually about, which is it's a political process. And as Julian Corbett would remind you, the best way to approach this is with a philosophical mindset, and that means reading Clausewitz. But don't read Clausewitz as a how-to manual, which most people do. It's a philosophy. It's not an instruction manual. Most war books are instruction manuals. Clausewitz is not. Clausewitz is a book that you can develop using your own evidence. So if you understand the military naval history of Catalonia and you read Clausewitz, you will find that Clausewitz will enable you to put forward a more coherent and sophisticated argument about what that experience means. So a philosophy, not a textbook. And that's the only strategy book you need to read before you start thinking about your own specific cases. And all the best analysts at the turn of the 20th century are doing this, particularly Corbett, but there are others. Even the Germans understand this. So you need to be philosophical. And that may apply to other things that you would like to do in the short to medium term. Thank you. The picture, of course, is a bit of Danish Navy PR, so for which I thank them.
Okay, so just one last thing before the coffees. As we told, Professor Lambert has a gargantuan production of books and articles and chapters. So here's a small selection, kind of starter's pack. The two books of today's lectures of what it's all about. It's Seapower Estates, mainly that your lecture condensed what the book is about. It's all about. It's a very interesting book. If you want to know all the differences. The other one, the British Way of War, that's all the struggle of Sir Julian Corbett in the British politics in order to develop a national strategy, and the problems within the rivalries between the services, the lack of education of the politicians, and the disaster of going in a continental commitment. And afterwards, a couple more. You know, if you want to study about grand strategy, the Crimean War, that's the kind of book not to read but to study of the war between 1853 and 56 between France and the British Empire against Russia, but also the several other actors like Turkey, Sweden, and some other. And last but not least, Britannia's God of War, Nelson. This is a kind of very complete biography, but except aside of the French, everybody loves Nelson. So if you want to enjoy like a children to with this book, and we will love Nelson still more. Okay, thank you very much. So time to break and coffees.